Deputy Frank Gallo figured he was the king of Havenwood. He pushed around old folks and took whatever he wanted. But he made a fatal mistake. He dumped scalding hot coffee on a sleeping German shepherd just to provoke a stranger. He didn't know the quiet man was a Navy SEAL, and he was about to take down an entire corrupt police force without firing a single shot. The morning air had a damp, industrial chill to it, a heavy gray blanket that the Ohio sun struggled to burn through. It clung to the old brick facades of Main Street and settled in the cracked asphalt, a constant reminder of the steel mills that had long since gone silent. It was a cold that seeped into your bones, promising a biting wind later in the day. But for now, the town was just stirring under a hazy, pale light. Inside the Havenwood diner, however, the air was warm, smelling of roasted coffee beans, frying sausage, and the faint, chemical scent of lemon-scented cleaner. The atmosphere was thick with the low hum of a rattling ventilation system and the sizzle of bacon on a greased-up flat-top grill. Cole Bishop sat in the farthest corner booth, his back pressed against the cool vinyl, a strategic position that gave him a clear view of the entire room without needing to turn his head. He was a man made of dense muscle and quiet observation, a faint, jagged scar along his jawline hinting at a life far less peaceful than this quiet breakfast corner. Lying silently beneath the table was Shadow, his large German shepherd, whose black and tan coat shone with health and meticulous care. Shadow was perfectly still, his chin resting lightly on Cole's boot, a quiet, steady weight that helped ground Cole in the moment. The brass bell over the door had been quiet for some time, allowing the soft murmur of the morning regulars to fill the space with a comfortable drone. Brenda, the waitress who'd been working the floor since the mid-80s, ambled over with a steaming coffee pot in one hand and a plastic pitcher of ice water in the other. She offered them a bright smile, her face crinkling into a map of deep, kind lines. "Morning, Cole," she said, her voice a little raspy but full of warmth, like dry leaves on pavement. "Brought some fresh ice water for this handsome gentleman under the table. It's supposed to be a hot one later, and we can't have him getting thirsty." Cole looked up and offered a rare, genuine smile that softened the hard, watchful lines of his face. "Thanks, Brenda," he replied, his deep voice a low rumble in his chest. "He appreciates it, and honestly, so do I." Brenda filled the collapsible silicone bowl Cole had already placed on the floor. "You two need anything else? More toast? Maybe a sausage link for Shadow?" she asked, winking playfully. "We're good, Brenda. Just the coffee is perfect," Cole said politely. She nodded, gave his shoulder a gentle, motherly pat, and said, "All right, hon, holler if you change your mind," before shuffling off to check on her other tables. Cole watched her go, a quiet sense of gratitude for the simple, unpretentious kindness of the place washing over him. He lifted his heavy ceramic mug, blowing the steam away before taking a slow, deliberate sip. For a fleeting moment, the world felt right, balanced, and safe. Then the front door flew open with such force that the brass bell clanged violently against the glass. The cozy atmosphere in the diner instantly soured. 3 uniformed deputies stepped inside, bringing with them a wave of damp air and an aura of arrogance that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. Leading them was Deputy Frank Gallo, a man whose reputation for bullying was as wide as his expanding waistline. He had a thick neck, a ruddy face, and small, cruel eyes that scanned the room looking for a target rather than a crime. "Smells like old grease and desperation in here, boys," Gallo announced loudly, his voice booming through the quiet diner, shattering the peace. His 2 subordinates chuckled nervously, echoing his sentiment like well-trained parrots. The regulars hunched over, their eyes suddenly fascinated by their plates of eggs and hash browns, hoping to avoid the bulldog's attention. Gallo's gaze swept over the counter, dismissed the menu, and settled on the corner booth. He spotted Cole, and then he spotted the black tip of Shadow's tail sticking out just a bit. A mean, bored glimmer lit up in his eyes. He nudged one of the other deputies, smirked, and jerked his head toward Cole. Gallo started down the narrow aisle, his heavy boots thudding ominously on the linoleum. He wasn't heading for a table. He was heading for a confrontation. As he neared Cole's booth, he didn't slow down or sidestep. He was holding a fresh, hot-to-go cup of coffee, the lid deliberately loose. Just as he was passing the booth, Gallo faked a stumble, tipping the cup with calculated precision. The dark, scalding liquid cascaded down, splashing across the floor just inches from Shadow's front paws. The radiating heat was instantaneous, and Shadow flinched, pulling his paws back with an audible huff. But the dog remained silent, his elite training overriding the natural instinct to yelp or snap. The diner fell into a dead, heavy silence. Gallo stopped and looked down, a mask of feigned surprise on his red, sweating face. "Whoops," Gallo said, letting out a dry, mirthless chuckle that sounded like gravel in a blender. My mistake. Didn't see the mutt there. He looked directly at Cole, his eyes daring him, challenging him to react. You really shouldn't bring a dangerous animal into a place where decent folks are trying to eat, Gallo sneered, stepping closer. It's a tripping hazard. Next time I might not be so clumsy. Cole sat perfectly still, his hand resting lightly on Shadow's neck, feeling the dog's muscles vibrating with tension. Cole's own pulse didn't quicken, and his breath didn't catch. He simply stared at Gallo with cold, flat eyes that held no fear or anger, just pure, lethal calculation. He's under the table, Cole said, his voice level and dangerously calm, cutting through the tension like a knife. He wasn't in your way. Gallo's smirk faltered slightly, unnerved by the complete lack of fear in the stranger's eyes. Watch your tone, pal, Gallo shot back, puffing out his chest to appear larger. I'm the law in this town. You and your dog are just passing through. Remember that. Gallo waited for a response, a shout, anything he could use as an excuse to escalate. But Cole gave him nothing but silence. Uncomfortable with the stillness, Gallo grunted, "Clean up that mess," before turning and swaggering to the counter, leaving the steaming puddle of coffee on the floor. Cole didn't look at the mess. His eyes were fixed on Gallo's back, burning the image of his badge number into his mind. Easy, he whispered to Shadow, rubbing the dog's soft ears. We're good, buddy. We're good. The dark roast puddle on the linoleum was disappearing under the absorbent white napkins Cole had quietly requested, the brown liquid seeping into the paper like ink into a blotter. Cole Bishop moved with the efficient grace of a man who had spent a lifetime cleaning up messes far more dangerous than spilled coffee. He wiped the floor dry, his face an unreadable mask, while Shadow sat beside him, the dog's amber eyes locked on the trio of uniformed deputies holding court in the center booth. The diner had returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the air remained thick and pressurized like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. The cheerful clatter of cutlery on plates had been replaced by anxious, whispered conversations. Cole returned to his seat, sliding into the booth and placing a reassuring hand on Shadow's head. He didn't leave. A civilian might have cut his losses, paid the bill, and driven until the city limits were a blur in the rearview mirror, but Cole was no civilian in spirit. He was a hunter who had just found his quarry, and he needed to understand the terrain before he made his move. He raised his mug, the coffee now cool, and watched over the rim as Deputy Frank Gallo and his two subordinates ate with a sloppy, entitled gluttony. They devoured stacks of pancakes and greasy strips of bacon, laughing loudly with their mouths full, treating the diner not as a place of business, but as their personal mess hall where the rules of polite society didn't apply. In the booth directly adjacent to Cole's, a new figure leaned in slightly, closing the gap between their tables with a conspiratorial shift of his posture. This was Walt, a man who looked as frail and ancient as the crumbling brick buildings outside. He was thin to the point of being gaunt, dressed in a faded plaid shirt buttoned to the collar and a cap that identified him as a veteran of the Second World War. His hands trembled with a constant rhythm, but his eyes, though clouded by cataracts and age, held a sharp, penetrating intelligence that belied his fragile frame. Walt pretended to stir his tea, but he spoke in a low, raspy whisper aimed in Cole's direction. "You got a lot of restraint, son," Walt murmured, not looking directly at Cole to avoid drawing attention. "Most men would have thrown a punch. I saw your hand twitch. You've seen a fight or two, haven't you?" Cole turned his head slightly, acknowledging the old soldier with a subtle nod. "Enough to know when to pick one," Cole answered softly. "Who is he?" "The loud one." Walt let out a sigh that sounded like air escaping a tire. "That's Frank Gallo. We call him the Bulldog, though that's an insult to bulldogs everywhere," Walt said, glancing affectionately at Shadow. "He runs this town like it's his personal playground. He pushes, he takes, and he breaks whatever he wants." Cole watched as Gallo wiped his mouth on the back of his hand, leaving a smear of grease on his cheek. "Why doesn't anyone stop him?" Cole asked, his eyes narrowing as he analyzed the group's dynamic. The other two deputies were clearly followers, laughing too hard at Gallo's jokes, their body language subservient and eager to please. Walt gave a humorless chuckle, a dry, rattling sound. "Because the apple doesn't fall far from the poison tree," Walt explained, his trembling hand gripping his teacup for stability. "Frank's father is Bill Gallo, the chief of police. Has been for 20 years. The county sheriff is Frank's uncle. The magistrate is his godfather. You getting the picture? You go up against the Bulldog, you're going up against the whole damn infrastructure of Havenwood. Folks around here, they just keep their heads down and pray he picks someone else to bully." The reality of it settled in Cole's mind, clicking into place like a magazine into a rifle. It wasn't just a rogue cop. It was a localized dictatorship. This explained the brazen arrogance, the lack of fear, and Gallo's absolute certainty that there would be no consequences for his actions. The meal at the center table was winding down. Gallo let out a loud belch, a sound that made several customers wince, and pushed his plate away. He stood, hitched his belt up over his belly, and the other two deputies immediately scrambled to their feet. They didn't reach for their wallets. There was no bill on the table. Gallo just nodded at the empty plates and started for the door, the unspoken deal hanging thick in the air. This was their protection tax, the price of doing business in a town owned by the Gallo family. They ate, they left, and the diner absorbed the cost. Cole watched this petty act of theft with a cold, simmering anger. It wasn't about the money, it was about the principle, the blatant abuse of power over people who couldn't fight back. As Gallo neared the front counter, Brenda was there, ringing up another customer's bill. She looked tired, her smile strained as she tried to ignore the looming presence of the three large men. Then it happened. A small, insignificant accident that shifted the gravity of the room. As Brenda turned to grab a mint for the paying customer, her elbow bumped a basket of silverware on the counter. A single metal fork skittered over the edge and fell to the floor with a sharp, echoing clang. It was a moment of nothing, a simple clumsiness of old age, but Gallo froze. He turned his head slowly, looking down at the fork as if it were a dead body. The diner went silent again. Gallo walked to the counter, invading Brenda's personal space, towering over the small, elderly woman. He didn't help her pick it up. Instead, he leaned down, his face inches from hers. "You're getting clumsy, Brenda," Gallo said, his voice dropping to a smooth, menacing tone that was far more terrifying than his shouting. "Dropping dirty utensils on the floor in a food establishment?" Brenda's hands trembled as she reached for a rag. "I'm sorry, Frank. It just slipped. I'll wash it right away," she stammered, her voice thin with fear. Gallo placed a heavy hand on the counter, tapping his fingers. "Hygiene is a serious thing," he said, enjoying the power he held over her. "I could call the health inspector right now, have him shut this place down for a full review. How are you going to pay your rent then, Brenda? How are you going to buy your medicine?" Cole felt a surge of heat in his chest, a physical manifestation of the rage that was threatening to boil over. He watched Brenda shrink back, her eyes wide and wet, terrified not just of the man, but of the ruin he represented. She was a woman who had worked her entire life, and this petty tyrant was threatening to destroy her world over a dropped fork. Gallo smirked, satisfied with the terror he had inflicted. "Be careful, old woman," he sneered. "Next time, I won't be so forgiving." He turned and walked out, the bell jingling cheerfully behind him, oblivious to the darkness he left in his wake. Cole sat motionless, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles were white. He wasn't leaving. Not yet. The reconnaissance had just begun, and the target had just painted a bullseye on his own back. The decision to stay in Havenwood wasn't made with a grand announcement or a dramatic gesture, but with the quiet, deadly certainty of a predator settling into a hunting blind. Cole Bishop walked out of the Havenwood diner, the brass bell jingling a final time behind him, and stepped back into the oppressive midday chill. He didn't turn back toward the highway. Instead, he drove his matte black pickup truck, a vehicle chosen for its reliability and lack of identifying features, to a secluded spot by an abandoned railway spur on the edge of town. The switch from rest mode to mission mode was instantaneous and absolute. For the next 48 hours, Cole ceased to be a weary traveler passing through Ohio and became what the Navy had spent millions of dollars training him to be, a ghost. He established a temporary base of operations in a thicket of overgrown brush where the shadows lingered and the air smelled of damp earth and rust. This wasn't about avenging a spilled cup of coffee. It was about confirming a hypothesis. Men like Frank Gallo were rarely isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a deeper rot, and Cole needed to know how deep the infection went before he performed surgery. Before the surveillance began in earnest, there was a ritual. Under the whispering canopy of old oak trees, as the sun began its descent below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange, Cole tended to shadow. This wasn't just maintenance. It was a nonverbal conversation. Cole sat on the tailgate of his truck, his movements slow and deliberate as he ran a brush through Shadow's thick coat. The rhythmic scratch of bristle-on fur was a hypnotic sound that seemed to lower the heart rate of both man and dog. Shadow leaned into Cole's leg, his eyes half closed in bliss, trusting Cole completely. Cole checked every inch of the dog, lifting each paw to inspect the pads for thorns or cuts, cleaning his ears, and running his hands over the powerful muscles to check for strain. "You're good, buddy. You're strong," Cole murmured, his voice a low vibration that Shadow felt more than heard. This grooming session was essential. It reinforced the bond that made them a single operational unit. In the field, Shadow wasn't a tool. He was a partner, and his well-being was a higher priority than Cole's own. Once the grooming was done, Cole reached into a lockbox in the truck bed and retrieved a tactical harness. It was a military-grade piece of equipment, lightweight but durable, designed to carry loads and, more importantly, surveillance gear. With practiced ease, Cole fitted a high-definition micro camera to the chest strap. It was no bigger than a matchbox, matte black and nearly invisible against Shadow's dark fur, capable of low-light recording and local transmission. "Time to go to work," Cole said softly. The change in Shadow was immediate. The dog's posture stiffened, his ears perked, and his playful demeanor vanished, replaced by a sharp, intense focus. For 2 days, they moved through the shadows of Havenwood. Cole didn't engage. He observed. He learned the rhythm of the town and the predictably arrogant patrol patterns of Deputy Gallo. He watched from parked cars, from rooftops, and from alleyways, noting that Gallo's cruiser spent more time parked behind businesses than it did patrolling the streets. On the evening of the second day, the intelligence gathering came to a head. Cole had tracked Gallo's patrol car to a poorly lit industrial park on the edge of town, a place of rusting corrugated metal fences and piles of discarded tires. The dampness had turned into a light, miserable drizzle that slicked the asphalt and muffled footsteps. Cole parked his truck a block away, hidden behind a dumpster, and deployed Shadow. "Go, observe," he commanded, using a hand signal that meant, "maintain stealth." Shadow melted into the darkness, a black shape moving within shadows, his paws making no sound on the wet pavement. Through a tablet screen in his truck, Cole watched the grainy but clear feed from the camera on Shadow's chest. Shadow moved along the perimeter of a fenced-in lot, staying low in the tall weeds until the camera had a clear view of the scene. Gallo's cruiser was idling next to a beat-up sedan with out-of-state plates. A man was standing outside the sedan looking terrified. He was a tourist, a middle-aged father in a soaked windbreaker and khakis, his hands trembling as he held out a wallet. This was the first target. Gallo was leaning out his window, his face illuminated by the harsh glow of the dashboard lights. "I'm telling you, the speed limit drops," Gallo's voice crackled through the audio feed, distorted but audible. "Now, we can go down to the station, impound this vehicle, and have a long talk with the magistrate on Monday. Or you can pay the out-of-towners on the spot fine. $500 cash." The tourist, desperate to protect his family who were likely huddled in the car, didn't argue. He fumbled with the bills, offering up a thick fold of cash. Gallo snatched it, grinned, and waved him away. "Drive safe now," Gallo mocked. As the tourist's car sped off, fleeing the uniformed predator, Cole felt a cold knot of disgust tighten in his stomach. But the night wasn't over. 10 minutes later, a second vehicle arrived. It was a rusty tow truck driven by a new player in the drama. The man who hopped out was a wiry individual with skin the color of old parchment and grease permanently etched into his fingerprints. He wore a mechanic's jumpsuit that had seen better decades and moved with the jerky, nervous energy of a rodent. This was Slim, a local chop shop operator known for taking cars apart faster than the owners could report them missing. Shadow, still hidden in the weeds, adjusted his position slightly as Cole guided him via a whispered command into his earpiece, the camera panning to capture the interaction. Slim approached the cruiser, but this time the dynamic was different. It wasn't fear. It was business. "Got the parts from that Civic you tipped me off about," Slim said, his voice wheezy and high-pitched, "cleaned and crated, ready to ship." Gallo nodded, lighting a cigarette, the flare of the match illuminating his greedy eyes. "Good, and my cut?" Gallo asked. Slim reached into his greasy jumpsuit and pulled out a thick envelope, passing it through the window. "Standard 20%, franc, plus a little extra for looking the other way last week." Gallo weighed the envelope in his hand. Satisfied. "Keep it quiet, Slim. I don't need the chief asking why the crime stats are down, but your inventory is up." The transaction was complete. Gallo had just taken a bribe from a criminal enterprise he was sworn to stop. It was a felony recorded in high definition. Cole watched the screen, his finger hovering over the save button, ensuring the file was encrypted and backed up to a secure cloud server instantly. He whispered a recall command into his earpiece. "Come home." Shadow turned, melting back into the darkness as quietly as he had come, leaving the two criminals to their self-satisfied smoke. Cole leaned back in the driver's seat of his truck, the light from the tablet illuminating his grim expression. He was no longer just a witness. He was holding the smoking gun. The evidence was undeniable, digital, and damning. The surveillance phase was over. Now it was time to decide how to detonate the bomb he had just built. Sunday mornings in Havenwood possessed a distinct rhythm, one considerably more vibrant and bustling than the sleepy quiet of the weekdays. The sun was high and bright, filtering through the weeping willows to cast dappled shadows on the sidewalk, while families fresh from church services flooded the streets in their Sunday best. Inside the Havenwood diner, the air was thick with the smells of sweet maple syrup, fried sausage, and the perfumed talc of the older church-going ladies. Every booth was full, and the counter was lined with men discussing sermons and the upcoming football season. Into the middle of this hustle, bustle, and familiarity, Cole Bishop walked. He wasn't in tactical gear or the nondescript clothes of a wanderer today. He wore a clean, pressed button-down shirt that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, looking every bit the polite visitor. His eyes, however, retained the sharp focus of a predator. At his heel, Shadow moved with the disciplined gait of a show dog, his coat brushed to a high gloss, wearing a service vest to discourage unwanted pets from curious children who pointed and whispered. Cole didn't look for an empty corner this time. He wasn't seeking the shadows. He walked directly into the middle of the room, his boots making a steady, solid thud on the hardwood floor that seemed to cut through the chatter. He was aiming for the best table in the house. It was a large, circular booth set perfectly in the bay window, offering a panoramic view of the main street and the parking lot. It was the kind of table that commanded respect, the captain's table of the establishment. It was also currently empty despite the line of people waiting at the door. The locals knew better. For years, this table had been unofficially reserved for Deputy Frank Gallo and his entourage during the Sunday rush. It was a throne for the town bully, kept empty by fear. Cole pulled out a chair, its legs scraping loudly against the floor, and sat down. He motioned for Shadow to take a down stay under the table, which the dog did instantly, facing the door. The effect on the room was subtle, but immediate, like a ripple spreading across a pond. Conversations faltered and died out in concentric circles expanding from Cole's table. Eyes darted toward him, then quickly away, as if looking at him might implicate them in his crime. The whispers began, a mixture of anxiety and a strange, suppressed thrill. They knew the rules, and they were watching a man who either didn't know them, or, more excitingly, didn't care. Brenda hurried over, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced with a nervous, fidgety energy. She wiped down the already spotless table with a trembling hand, her eyes darting toward the front door. "Cole, honey," she whispered, leaning in close so only he could hear. "You really shouldn't be sitting here. This is... well, you know whose table this is. They come in every Sunday right about now." She looked at him with genuine concern, her brow furrowed deep with worry. Cole smiled at her, a calm, reassuring expression that didn't quite reach his watchful eyes. "It's got the best view, Brenda, and it was empty," he said simply. "I'll have the steak and eggs, medium rare, and a bowl of water for Shadow." Brenda hesitated, wringing her hands in her apron, but she saw the resolve in his face. She nodded, a quiet resignation settling over her. A few minutes later, she returned, not just with water, but with a small plate of warm buttermilk biscuits that Cole hadn't ordered. "On the house," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "You might need the energy." It was a small act of rebellion, a token of support from a woman who had been bullied for too long. Cole nodded his thanks, broke off a piece of a biscuit, and slipped a piece to Shadow under the table. The wait wasn't long. At 10 o'clock on the dot, the heavy oak door swung open. The atmosphere in the diner shifted instantly from anxious anticipation to a suffocating dread. Deputy Frank Gallo strode in, flanked by his two usual deputies. They were laughing loud and boisterously, having already unbuckled their utility belts to make room for the massive meal they expected. Gallo looked like a man who owned the world, his uniform straining over his bulk, his face flushed with the heat and his own arrogance. He scanned the room, giving a dismissive wave to a few locals who nodded obsequiously in his direction. Then his eyes turned toward the bay window. The laughter died in his throat. He stopped short, his deputies nearly crashing into him. Gallo blinked as if he couldn't process the visual information. Someone was in his seat. And not just anyone, but the drifter with the dog, the man he had humiliated or tried to humiliate just days before. Blood rushed to Gallo's face, turning it a deep, ugly shade of crimson. The silence in the diner was now absolute. Even the fry cook had stopped scraping the grill. Gallo marched across the room, his hand resting on the nightstick at his hip, not drawing it, but accentuating its presence. The heavy thud of his boots was the only sound in the room. He reached the table and loomed over Cole, blocking out the sun. Cole didn't look up. He was busy cutting a piece of his steak with surgical precision, his knife moving smoothly against the ceramic plate. Gallo unhooked his nightstick and tapped it on the tabletop. Tap, 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 a sharp, jarring sound designed to startle. "You're in my seat, pal," Gallo growled, his voice a low rumble of threatened authority. "I think you need to move. Now." The command hung in the air, heavy and toxic. The entire town was watching, holding its breath, waiting for the violence. Cole finished cutting his piece of meat. He set his knife and fork down neatly on the edge of the plate. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his head. His expression was one of boredom, almost disappointment. He looked at the nightstick, then up at Gallo's furious eyes. "I checked the reservation book up front," Cole said, his voice calm, clear, and loud enough for every frozen customer in the room to hear. "There's no name on this table, deputy. And unless you have a warrant for this steak, I plan on finishing it." The silence in the Havenwood diner was fragile, a thin sheet of glass waiting to be shattered by the slightest movement. Deputy Frank Gallo stood over the table, his face a mottled map of disbelief and rapidly darkening rage. He had been challenged in his own kingdom in front of his subjects by a stranger who didn't even have the decency to look afraid. The air conditioner rattled on, but it did nothing to cool the sudden, intense heat in the room. Gallo didn't speak again. Words had failed him, so he resorted to the only language he was truly fluent in: force. He took a half step back and gave a sharp, definitive jerk of his chin toward Cole, a silent command to his two subordinates who had been hovering eagerly behind him like vultures waiting for a carcass. The two deputies moved with the practiced synchronicity of schoolyard bullies. To Gallo's left was Deputy Dawkins, a thin, angular man with a weaselly face and eyes that constantly darted around as if looking for an escape route or a weapon. He was small but vicious, the kind of man who loved the authority of the badge because it protected him from the consequences of his own cruelty. To the right was Deputy Peterson, a slow-moving wall of muscle with a shaved head and a vacant expression that suggested he followed orders because thinking was too much effort. Dawkins moved first, his target not the man, but the animal. He knew that the quickest way to break a man was to hurt what he loved. Dawkins lunged forward, a cruel smirk twisting his thin lips, and aimed a sharp, brutal kick directly at Shadow's ribs under the table. The heavy police-issue boot connected with a sickening thud. Shadow let out a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the floorboards, a sound so primal and dangerous that the patrons in the nearest booth instinctively recoiled. The dog's lips curled back, exposing white canines capable of crushing bone, and his muscles coiled to spring. Dawkins flinched, stumbling back, his hand fumbling for his weapon. But before the dog could launch, Cole's voice cut through the noise, not loud, but commanding absolute obedience. "Stand," Cole said, his voice flat and hard. "Down. Stay." It was a testament to thousands of hours of elite training that Shadow froze instantly. The dog didn't relax. His amber eyes were locked on Dawkins's throat with murderous intent, but he did not attack. He held his position, a statue of controlled fury, trusting his handler to deal with the threat. The cruelty of the unprovoked attack on the dog sent a shockwave through the diner. In the booth next to them, Walt, the frail World War II veteran, couldn't stay seated any longer. His sense of justice, forged in the fires of a war against tyranny, overrode his physical weakness. He rose to his shaky feet, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his table. "That's enough," Walt yelled, his voice cracking with age but full of outrage. "You don't kick a dog. What's wrong with you people?" He reached out a trembling hand to grab Dawkins's shoulder, a futile attempt to stop the abuse. Deputy Peterson, the giant, didn't even look at the old man. He simply extended one massive arm and shoved Walt backward with the casual indifference of someone swatting a fly. Walt went flying, his body hitting the vinyl seat of his booth with a heavy, jarring thud that knocked the wind out of him. A collective gasp of horror went through the crowd. Brenda screamed, dropping a rattling tray of silverware that added to the chaos. That was the breaking point. Cole stopped cutting his steak. He put his knife down very slowly. The calm exterior was still there, but the temperature behind his eyes had dropped to absolute zero. Gallo saw the shift and panicked. He snatched the X-26 taser from his belt, the yellow plastic weapon looking like a toy in his beefy fist. "You're under arrest for disorderly conduct and resisting," Gallo yelled, his voice cracking. He didn't wait for compliance. He aimed for Cole's chest and pulled the trigger. The pop of the compressed nitrogen cartridge firing was audible, but Cole was already moving. With reflexes honed in the chaos of close-quarters combat, Cole didn't just dodge, he flowed. He pivoted his torso to the left, the two barbed probes whizzing past him to embed harmlessly in the booth's upholstery. In the same fluid motion, Cole was up. He didn't attack Gallo. He dismantled him. Cole's left hand clamped onto Gallo's wrist, controlling the weapon hand, while his right forearm drove into the elbow joint. He pivoted, using Gallo's own momentum and body weight against him. There was a blur of motion, a sharp cry of pain from Gallo, and then a deafening thud as the bulldog went down face first on the diner floor. Cole had him pinned in a wrist lock that would snap the bone if Gallo moved an inch. The taser skittered across the floor, useless. The diner fell into a stunned, ringing silence. The town tyrant was on his knees, his face pressed into the dirty linoleum, helpless at the hands of a man who hadn't even broken a sweat. But the victory was momentary. Freeze. Let him go. Let him go now. Dawkins screamed, his voice breaking in terror. Both Dawkins and Peterson had drawn their service pistols. The black muzzles of two Glock 17s were pointed directly at Cole's head. The room froze. This was the precipice. Cole could feel the strain in Gallo's arm, could hear the shallow, panicked breathing of the two deputies behind him. He could break Gallo's arm. He could probably disarm Dawkins before he fired, but he couldn't stop them both without risking a stray round hitting Brenda or Walt or Shadow. Cole made the calculation in a split second. The physical fight was won. Now he had to win the war. He slowly released the pressure on Gallo's wrist. He opened his hands, showing them his palms, and slowly stood up. "I'm complying," Cole announced, his voice even and loud, ensuring every witness heard. "I am unarmed. I am surrendering." He turned his back to the guns and placed his hands behind his head, lacing his fingers together. Gallo scrambled to his feet, his face red, humiliated, and furious. "Cuff him. Cuff him now," Gallo screamed, nursing his aching wrist. Peterson holstered his weapon and lunged, slamming Cole against the window and wrenching his arms down to slap on the handcuffs. The metal ratchets clicked 1, 2, 3 times. Cole didn't fight. He stood straight, looking out the window at the sunny street, his face a blank mask. He let them take him, let them think they had won. But as they marched him toward the door, leaving a growling Shadow to be cornered by animal control, Cole knew the truth. He had just baited them into assaulting a decorated veteran, falsely arresting him, and menacing civilians, all on camera with half the town as witnesses. The trap wasn't just set. It had snapped shut around their necks. The ride to the Havenwood Police Department was a short, silent journey conducted in the back of a patrol car that smelled of old sweat and lemon-scented disinfectant. Cole Bishop sat with his hands cuffed tightly behind him, his posture straight and relaxed, leaning into the hard plastic seat as the town slid by in a blur of green and brick. He wasn't looking at the scenery. He was counting the seconds, mapping the route, and logging every turn. When the cruiser finally pulled into the back lot of the station, a low-slung brick building that looked more like a fortress than a public service office, Cole was roughly hauled out by Deputy Peterson. The heat of the day had reached its peak, baking the asphalt. But as they dragged him through the heavy rear steel doors, the temperature instantly dropped to a sterile, artificial cold. The station hummed with the low-grade noise of bureaucracy, a distant phone ringing and the clack of keyboards. But as they led him deeper into the building, those sounds faded, replaced by the heavy thud of boots on concrete. They bypassed the booking desk entirely, a breach of procedure that did not escape Cole's notice. Instead, they took him straight down a narrow cinderblock hallway painted a dreary institutional beige, leading him to the interrogation room at the very end of the hall. The room was a windowless box designed to strip a man of his sense of time and self. It contained nothing but a scarred metal table bolted to the floor and 3 chairs. A two-way mirror dominated one wall, a dark, reflective eye that offered no privacy. Peterson shoved Cole into a chair, twisting his arms to thread the cuffs through a metal loop welded to the table, effectively tethering him. "Don't get comfortable," Peterson grunted, his voice echoing in the small space before he turned and walked out, the heavy steel door slamming shut with a finality that would have terrified a lesser man. Cole was alone. The silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic, annoying buzz of a flickering fluorescent tube overhead. But if he strained his ears, focusing through the walls, he could hear it. Faint, muffled, but clear. A dog barking. Shadow. They hadn't taken him to the pound. They'd locked him in the K9 kennel out in the back lot. The bark was deep, repetitive, and urgent. It was not the bark of fear. It was a beacon. Shadow was signaling his position, letting Cole know he was still in the fight. Cole closed his eyes, blocking out the sterile room, and let his mind drift back to a memory from a decade ago. He was in a muddy foxhole in a country whose name no longer mattered, shivering in the rain. Next to him was Chief Petty Officer Russo, a man carved from granite with a mustache that looked like steel wool and eyes that had seen too much. Russo had been cleaning his rifle with slow, methodical movements while mortar fire walked closer to their position. "You know the difference between a victim and a warrior, Bishop?" Russo had asked, his voice calm amidst the chaos. "A victim panics. A victim flails. A warrior waits. He becomes a coiled spring. The tighter they squeeze, the more potential energy you store. You let them compress you until they think they've won. And then when they blink, you expand." Cole opened his eyes. The memory settled over him like a suit of armor. He was the coiled spring. He sat perfectly still, his breathing slow and even, listening to the distant bark of his partner and waiting for the door to open. He didn't have to wait long. The lock made a heavy clunk, and the door swung open. Deputy Frank Gallo strode in, followed by Deputy Dawkins, who leaned against the doorframe to block the exit. Gallo looked worse than he had at the diner. His wrist was wrapped in an elastic bandage, and his face was a mask of bruised ego and simmering violence. He didn't sit. He paced the small room, circling Cole like a shark that smelled blood in the water. "You think you're tough, huh?" Gallo sneered, his voice dripping venom. "You think because you know a few karate moves, you can come into my town and embarrass me in front of my own people?" Gallo stopped pacing and leaned over the table, his face inches from Cole's. "We ran your name. Nothing on file, just a ghost. That's fine. Ghosts disappear all the time, and no one ever misses them." Cole remained silent, his gaze fixed on a spot on the wall just past Gallo's ear. This indifference infuriated Gallo even more. He straightened up and looked at the corner of the ceiling where a small security camera blinked with a red light. With a deliberate, theatrical move, Gallo reached up and covered the lens with his hat, then walked to the wall switch and flipped a breaker. The red light on the camera died. The room was now off the record. "Now," Gallo said, a cruel smile spreading across his face as he unclipped his heavy, collapsible baton from his belt. He flicked his wrist and the steel weapon expanded with a sharp shink. "It's just us. No witnesses, no cameras, just a little lesson in respect." He tapped the baton into the palm of his other hand, the rhythm mimicking the beat of a heart. "I'm gonna break that hand you grabbed me with," Gallo promised softly. "And then we'll go outside and see how tough your mutt is when he's looking at a bolt gun." Gallo raised the baton high, his muscles tensing for a bone-shattering strike. The violence was imminent, a suspended guillotine blade. "Before you swing that," Cole said. His voice wasn't loud, but it stopped Gallo's arm in midair. It was the voice of a man discussing the weather, completely at odds with the situation. Cole finally looked directly into Gallo's eyes, his gaze intense and piercing. "You should know that the tactical harness on my dog isn't just for carrying water." Gallo hesitated, the baton still raised, confusion flickering in his eyes. "What the hell are you babbling about?" Gallo snapped. Cole continued, his words precise and devastating. "It's outfitted with a military-grade, encrypted body camera and a cellular uplink. It's been recording since I left my campsite. It recorded you taking a bribe from the mechanic. It recorded you taking cash from the tourist. And right now," Cole leaned forward slightly, testing the limit of his cuffs, "it is live streaming audio and video to a secure cloud server monitored by the Federal Military Police and the NCIS Cybersecurity Division." The silence that followed was heavier than any physical blow. Gallo's face went from flushed red to a pasty, sick white in a heartbeat. The baton wavered in his hand. You're lying," Gallo stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. He was remembering the blinking light on the harness, the strange gear he had dismissed. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Cole Bishop, United States Navy, currently on active reserve status," Cole stated, the rank hanging in the air like a hammer. "If I don't enter a code into my phone in the next 10 minutes to confirm my safety, a duress signal is sent with my GPS coordinates. Federal agents have been watching the feed. They heard you threaten my life. They saw you turn off that camera. They are listening to us right now." Cole nodded at the baton still in Gallo's trembling hand. "So, Deputy Gallo, by all means. Hit me. Add assaulting a federal officer to the list of felonies you've committed today. I'm sure the judge will be very interested in the footage." Gallo slowly lowered his arm, the baton slipping from his sweaty grasp and clattering to the floor. The bully had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had just flashed a federal badge. The 10 minutes Cole had promised Frank Gallo felt less like a measure of time and more like the slow, agonizing descent of a guillotine blade. Gallo stood frozen in the middle of the interrogation room, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths, the baton lying at his feet like a discarded toy. Dawkins, the weasel-faced deputy, had shrunk into the farthest corner, his eyes wide and darting nervously between Cole and the door, realizing far too late they had bitten into something that was about to swallow them whole. Cole remained seated, his hands still cuffed to the table, but the power dynamic in the room had been completely inverted. He was no longer the prisoner. He was the judge awaiting the executioner. Exactly 20 minutes after Cole had been dragged into the station, the atmosphere in the building changed violently. It didn't start with a knock, but with the rumble of heavy engines outside, a sound deeper and far more aggressive than the local patrol cars. Through the thin walls, a commotion erupted at the front desk, shouts, the stamp of boots, and sharp, authoritative commands that could not be argued with. The door to the interrogation room didn't just open. It was thrown wide with enough force to bounce off its rubber stopper. Leading the charge was Captain Evans of the Ohio State Highway Patrol, a man who looked like he was carved from granite and wore a uniform so crisp it could have cut skin. He was tall, imposing, and wore a campaign hat pulled low over eyes that swept the room with laser-like precision. Flanking him were 4 military police officers, their armbands identifying them as MP and their hands resting casually but ready on their sidearms. But the figure who commanded the most immediate attention walked between them. She was a woman in her 60s dressed in a sharp, charcoal gray power suit with a string of real pearls around her neck. She had steel gray hair cut in a severe but elegant bob and eyes that held the frightening intelligence of a predator. This was Federal Judge Evelyn Reed, a woman whose name was whispered with fear in courtrooms across the Southeast, and a close family friend who had watched Cole grow from a boy into a warrior. "Uncuff him!" Captain Evans barked, his voice echoing off the cinderblock walls. He wasn't looking at Gallo. He was looking at the handcuffs on Cole. Gallo, trembling like a leaf in a storm, fumbled for his keys, dropping them twice before finally managing to work the lock. Cole stood, rubbing his wrists, and gave a respectful nod to the captain and the judge. "Took you long enough," Cole quipped, a small ghost of a smile playing on his lips. Evelyn Reed stepped forward, ignoring the trembling local deputies, and placed a hand on Cole's arm. "Traffic was dreadful, Cole," she said, her voice cultured and smooth, but carrying an undercurrent of absolute steel. "And I had to make sure the U.S. attorney was fully briefed before I drove down here to clean up this mess." She turned slowly to face Gallo, her expression shifting from warmth to cold disgust. "Deputy Gallo, I presume. I'm Judge Reed, and you are in a kind of trouble your father can't buy you out of." Gallo tried to bluster, searching for a scrap of his lost bravado. "Now wait a minute, Judge," he sputtered, sweat beading on his nose. "This man is a drifter. He assaulted an officer. We were within our rights here." Cole stepped forward, cutting him off. "Actually," Cole said, his voice ringing out clearly for the cluster of honest deputies who had gathered in the hallway to watch. "I was lying earlier. I'm not a retired Master Chief." He reached into his back pocket, the one that hadn't been searched because they were too arrogant to follow procedure, and pulled out a military ID, flipping it open. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Cole Bishop, United States Navy SEALs, currently on active reserve status, and you just assaulted a commissioned officer during what has now become a federal investigation." The color drained completely from Gallo's face, leaving him looking like a corpse. "Captain Evans, if you would," Judge Reed commanded. Captain Evans placed a rugged, heavy-duty laptop on the metal table and swiveled it so everyone, including the deputies in the hall, could see the screen. "We pulled this from the cloud server 5 minutes ago," Evans announced. He hit play. The video was crystal clear. It showed the diner from Shadow's perspective. The audio captured the sizzle of coffee hitting the floor, Shadow's pained flinch, and Gallo's cruel, mocking voice. "Whoops, my mistake. Didn't see the mutt there." Then it cut to the industrial park. The image of Gallo taking cash from the terrified tourist was undeniable. Then the exchange with Slim the mechanic. The cash envelope changing hands. The discussion of stolen parts. It was all there. Every felony, every abuse of power broadcast in high definition. A murmur went through the hallway. The other Havenwood deputies, the men and women who had been silenced by Gallo's bullying for years, looked at each other. The fear was breaking. Disgust was taking its place. "That's enough," Captain Evans said, snapping the laptop shut with finality. He turned to Gallo, Dawkins, and Peterson. "Frank Gallo, Deputy Dawkins, Deputy Peterson. You are under arrest for racketeering, bribery, animal cruelty, assault on a federal officer, and deprivation of rights under color of law." The MPs moved in. It was not a gentle arrest. They spun Gallo around, slamming him against the very wall he had tried to use to intimidate Cole. Gallo cried out as the handcuffs, real steel ones, not plastic zip ties, bit into his wrists. Captain Evans reached out and ripped the badge from Gallo's chest, tearing the fabric of his shirt. He did the same to Dawkins and Peterson. The tearing sound of Velcro was the sound of their power dissolving. Just then, the wall phone in the interrogation room rang. It was a harsh, jarring sound. The light on the console was blinking red. The direct line. The police chief's office. The room went silent. Everyone knew who was on the other end of that line. Bill Gallo had heard the sirens. Judge Reed walked to the phone. She picked up the receiver with one delicate hand. "Gallo here. What in the hell is going on down there?" A booming voice screamed through the line loud enough for Cole to hear. "I want that drifter gone, Frank. You hear me?" Judge Reed waited a beat, letting the silence stretch. "Mr. Mayor," she said, her voice dangerously calm and cold. "This is Federal Judge Evelyn Reed. Your son is currently in military police custody. I suggest you save your breath for your own attorney, because the FBI is currently serving a warrant on your office as we speak." She didn't wait for a reply. She hung up the phone with a decisive click that signaled the end of an era for Havenwood. Cole looked at her and nodded. "Thanks, Aunt Evie," he whispered. "Anytime, kiddo," she replied with a wink. "Now, let's go find your dog." The storm that had been threatening Havenwood for days finally broke overnight, washing away the oppressive, damp chill and leaving behind a morning that was crisp, clean, and impossibly green. Puddles on the asphalt reflected the puffy white clouds drifting lazily across the sky, and the oppressive weight that had settled over the town was gone, replaced by a light breeze that smelled of damp earth and blooming magnolias. Cole Bishop stood outside the Havenwood Police Department one last time, not as a prisoner, but as a free man. His truck, returned with profuse apologies from the new acting chief, idled softly at the curb, its engine a steady, reliable hum. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, his head out the slightly open window, taking in the fresh air with eager sniffs. Cole could have driven away right then. The road called to him, the endless ribbon of highway being the closest thing he had to a home, but there was one last piece of unfinished business. He put the truck in gear and turned the wheel, not toward the interstate, but back toward the center of town. When he pulled into the lot of the Havenwood Diner, the difference was palpable. The patrol car that used to loom menacingly near the entrance, blocking the best spots, was gone. In its place were family sedans and rusty pickup trucks parked in a haphazard but cheerful jumble. The cloud of fear that had hung over the building like a shroud had lifted, burned away with the morning mist. Cole stepped out of his truck and Shadow hopped down beside him, his tail giving a loose, happy wag it hadn't managed in days. When Cole pushed open the door, the brass bell jingled, but this time the sound didn't trigger a fearful hush. Instead, it was met by a happy roar of conversation, clattering forks, and genuine, unforced laughter. The diner was packed, vibrant, and alive. Heads turned as he entered, but there was no suspicion in the eyes that met his. There was recognition, awe, and a deep, collective gratitude. Cole moved toward the counter, intending just to grab a coffee to go, but he didn't get far. "There he is, the man of the hour," a voice rang out. It was Brenda. She bustled out from behind the counter, moving with an energy that defied her 70-some years. Her apron was spotless. Her silver hair was pinned up neatly, and the worried lines that had etched her face yesterday seemed to have been smoothed away by relief. She didn't ask for his order, she simply walked up to the large, formidable Navy SEAL and wrapped her arms around his waist in a fierce, grandmotherly hug. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for giving us our town back." Cole, normally stiff and reserved with strangers, hesitated only a second before gently patting her on the back. "Just doing what needed to be done, Brenda," he replied softly. She led him not to a stool at the counter, but to the large, circular table by the window, the captain's table Gallo had claimed as his throne. It was occupied today by Walt and a few of his fellow veterans, but they immediately shifted to make room. "Sit," Walt commanded, his eyes twinkling with a vitality Cole hadn't seen before. The old man looked 10 years younger, his shoulders no longer slumped, and his hands, while still trembling slightly, held his coffee cup with a newfound steadiness. "We took a vote," Walt rasped, grinning. "This is the people's table now. And you're the guest of honor." Cole sat, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee Brenda placed in front of him. This wasn't a formal ceremony. It was something better. It was a community breathing a collective sigh of relief. Plates of food began to arrive, not just for Cole, but for Shadow. The cook, a shy man with a grease-stained apron who normally hid in the kitchen, emerged carrying a large ceramic plate. On it were 3 thick, premium-cut Cumberland sausages cooked to perfection alongside a generous portion of scrambled eggs. He set it on the floor for Shadow. "On the house," the cook mumbled, wiping his hands on his apron. "Real meat, not that scrap stuff." Shadow didn't need to be told twice. He looked to Cole for permission, and when Cole nodded, he began to devour the meal with polite but enthusiastic gusto. For Cole, Brenda brought a slice of still steaming apple pie topped with a scoop of vanilla ice cream that was already starting to melt into sweet rivulets. "Breakfast dessert," she declared. "It's a tradition starting today." They sat for an hour, swapping stories, not of war or conflict, but of life. Walt talked about his grandkids in Atlanta. Brenda talked about her garden. Other patrons stopped by the table one by one to shake Cole's hand or simply nod their appreciation. It was a purely American scene, a tableau of resilience and neighborly affection that had survived under the boot of a bully and was now blossoming in the sun. Cole listened more than he talked, soaking in the peace. He knew he couldn't stay. He was a creature of motion, a shark that had to keep swimming. But he also knew he would carry this moment with him. It was a reminder of what he fought for. Not for flags or politics, but for places like Havenwood, where decent people just wanted to eat their eggs without fear. Finally, the road called. Cole stood, placing a $50 bill on the table. Brenda immediately snatched it up and tried to press it back into his pocket. "Your money's no good here, Cole Bishop." "Not today, not ever," she playfully scolded. Cole smiled, took her hand, and gently closed her fingers over the bill. "Then put it in the tip jar, Brenda. For the scholarship fund," he said, nodding toward the young busboy clearing tables. She looked at him, her eyes welling up, and nodded. "You take care of yourself," she said. "And you take care of that beautiful dog." Cole gave a low whistle for Shadow, who licked his plate clean and trotted to his side. They walked toward the door, the diner once again falling into a respectful quiet. But this was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of reverence. Cole pushed open the door and stepped out into the bright sun. As he walked toward his truck, he heard the door open behind him. He turned. Walt had followed him out, leaning on his cane. Behind Walt was Brenda, the cook, the busboy, and then the rest of the diner patrons, spilling out onto the sidewalk like a congregation after a sermon. They didn't say a word. As Cole opened the driver's side door, Walt straightened up, ignoring the ache in his old joints. He let go of his cane, letting it clatter to the concrete, and brought his trembling hand to his forehead in a sharp, perfect military salute. It was a salute from one soldier to another, acknowledging a debt that could never be paid in dollars. Beside Walt, a young father in a baseball cap placed a hand over his heart. So did Brenda. Slowly, one by one, the entire group, 20 or 30 strong, followed suit. Some saluted, some placed hands over their hearts. Some simply stood with their heads bowed in respect. They stood in a silent phalanx, honoring the stranger who had drifted into their nightmare and woken them up. Cole paused, his hand on the truck door. He looked at them, burning their faces into his memory. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He simply stood tall, brought his hand up, and returned Walt's salute with a sharp, precise motion of his own. He held it for a heartbeat, acknowledging them, acknowledging the peace he was leaving behind. Then, he climbed into the truck. The engine rumbled to life. Cole didn't look in the rearview mirror as he turned onto the main road, driving past the Welcome to Havenwood sign. He didn't have to. He knew the town was okay. The shadow was gone, the sun was out, and the road ahead was wide open.